Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Gameweek 12 cheat sheet. Apologies about the lack of content over this break. Unfortunately, I've had an ear infection and that has kind of kept me out of commission for a bit. So that's why we've had a little bit of a backlog of videos. I will still try to get the What We've Learned video out if possible, but it might be a skip this international break. Although, of course, you know, I'm keeping track of a lot of the trends and this will be reflected within the cheat sheet video, for example, for this week. But otherwise, that's sort of the explanation. I did enjoy my holiday right before this, but it's just not been the best coming back. And you've probably even noticed the burst blood vessel in my eye, but that is that. Let's just jump into the cheat sheet. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list in FPL recapping how I feel about the different assets in terms of their price points, the kind of valuation, looking ahead at the fixture run, not just the 3 fixtures we have, but 5 to 6 fixtures in the distance, even going up to 8. Looking at the underlying stats so far, how they've progressed, how the trends have moved on, my sort of understanding of their minutes against the expectations of certain players and against the kind of income expectations in terms of, let's say, how I feel about how strong someone is in terms of the manager's pecking order, things like that. In the midfield position, I feel like we don't have too many changes. It's unfortunately a position that I think is more so going to be hurt in a few more weeks in terms of how shallow the depth of the pool is because of AFCON, right? So in a few weeks' time, we'll have AFCON Gameweek 16. Yes, of course, a lot of people have free transfers coming up in the short distance, but I think that the general concern is there really too many moves to make? Now, the interesting piece is that players like maybe an Mbemo will leave the game, Sar will leave the game, so I think a lot of transfers will be necessitated then. At the same time, I think this is like a period where you can consider moving away from even someone like Njai or some of the other mainstays in the midfield who simply have worse fixtures, and that even goes towards players like a Paqueta or an Enzo who's been quite popular as of late. In the position, I would say I'd add Weaver in 4.9. My concern still is that with Veltman coming back, his position within the team can be a bit more fragile, but I think he's also put in some really good performances as of late. However, I think you just have to understand that Hertzler is going to be quite temperamental as a manager. So it's very likely that someone like Weaver can lose his position within the team relatively quickly, not in the sense that he's going to be a permanent starter, but more so that he's going to be prone towards the benching. And so that, for a player in this position, is not ideal because it could be the case that he gets rotated on one of the good games that you choose to plan to play him for. In the next tier, I've given Anderson a rise, and I think this is now a very small sliver of pen share. Now, if Chris Wood is to come back into the game, if Gibbs White was on the pitch, I still feel like Gibbs White takes the penalty over Anderson. I certainly think Chris Wood takes the penalty over Anderson too. So that's the concern I have if you're trying to ascribe that the pen share is massive for Anderson. I think this is realistically maybe 10 to 15% of the time going forwards, and it could reduce, especially if, let's say, Wood's minutes improve or even Gibbs White gets to see out full games. What I would say, though, is that his DEFCON rate has still been very, very solid this season. So when you kind of compare to, let's say, someone like Weaver, the pro of someone like Elliot Anderson is, of course, he has actual good baselines in sort of NPXG in terms of the kind of shots that he'll take. I think he'll score a goal in open play this season, unlike someone like Weaver, who's probably very unlikely to do that, although Weaver has pretty good XAG per 90. But as I said, potentially fragile minutes or more fragile minutes going forwards, whereas Anderson is basically a permanent out player and you don't have to run that risk. Fixtures aren't amazing for Nottingham Forest, but at the same time, at this price point, you're not really considering Anderson as a perma play. I've also removed some of the other sort of players recently who I just don't favor so much, right? I think you've probably noticed that Potts has been a part of the cheat sheet, and I think there is not really a need to spend too much money within this position unless players have multiple sort of levels of offerings. And so when we go back to even someone like Dewsbury Hall, at least he's an exceptional sort of player when it comes to the underlying stats from the creativity standpoint, despite not having, for example, the C-bid as some of the other players here. In the sort of next tier, I've given Jeremy a rise because I think his minutes for Palace are very good and they're getting better. And this is whilst Sar is still within the team. So you can expect as soon as AFCON rolls around that I think Jeremy's minutes will stay close to perfect. And as someone who's involved within this Palace offense, I think he's just someone who does warrant the price point that he sits at. Yes, of course, it's a small sample size, but the key thing is if you look at the sort of level of production that this Palace team has, simply being an attacker within that trident, I think, is just going to be massive. You can see, for example, when a player like, let's say, Kamada plays a bit more advanced, that he also benefits within that individual game. But because, of course, someone like Kamada does play multiple roles within the team, his underlyings aren't very good. Jeremy is someone who, as a winger, is just naturally going to play consistently in good positions for this Palace team. And I think there's it's very hard to almost reject how good Palace are on offense. Although, yes, they have underscored their goals compared to their expected goals. I just think that when you look at individual picks from Palace, there's not much of a justification to sort of ignore them. So Yeremy is actually a very interesting pick going forwards, as Palace have a really good run of games. None of the players here below Yeremy are that interesting. Keep in mind that Paqueta will be suspended for Game Week 11, so he won't play this match in Game Week 11. And then, of course, the West Ham fixtures get worse and worse. Plus, I think his DEFCON rate has not been as impressive as I anticipated, and partially that could also just be due to the mixture of positions that he's actually played, in contrast compared to some of the different managers. So I could be maybe, let's say, a bit more intrigued by just looking at Paqueta's numbers under Nuno with a little bit more sample size in a few game weeks in, and maybe that can change my mind. But for now, nothing too interesting from Paqueta, and he's just not someone who's really shown up much in terms of the underlying stats, despite playing advanced for some of the recent games for West Ham. With Jorginho, I think the minutes are strong enough, but he's still a differential to me. I think ultimately when you look at Jorginho, it doesn't seem like he's going to get a lot of center forward share. It doesn't seem like he's that productive as a 10. So it almost kind of reminds me of João Pedro last season, although his numbers are much, much worse. I think when you look at in terms of the NPXG, that's shockingly poor for someone who does occupy central channels. Now, you can probably say that the Brighton team probably relies on sort of production from the wingers and then specifically from their striker, and less so, for example, genuine production from the 10. But that's still very, very poor for what is a relatively good team. Like, if you think about a nailed Brighton player, most of the time, a nailed Brighton attacking asset is going to be undervalued in FPL in the sense that I think Brighton has probably been mispriced as a team. But Jorginho, his underlying stats, I still think are very subpar. With Merino, I think the concern is just around the Gyökeres time frame. So is he going to last as a sort of strong differential pick? I'm not sure. So I think that's more a timeline thing for me, more so than underlying stats, more so than how I think he can produce if he was going to get good minutes consistently going forwards. Now, the next tier, of course, I love Minte, but I've added Dango as a new pick. I've also added Ahmad, but Ahmad is an extremely sort of short expiry date pick. I still think that people can actually look at this game week as an opportunity to move into players like Mbeumo, move into Sarr, move into Amad Diallo, if this is kind of what your team allows for the next few weeks, because I tend to see that players like Ahmad and Mbeumo and Sarr, their minutes are close to perfect. Ahmad has gotten some early substitutions, but I think you're seeing as well that he is absolutely key towards the team. And I think the early substitutions where Amorim has, let him go off the pitch has probably actually reduced the Man United performance overall. And I think that's why we saw, for example, within the previous match when they actually needed to chase, someone like Ahmad stays on the field to be able to kind of produce the full result. And so, yeah, I think his minutes will be good. And the underlying stats from the sort of position that he's operating in terms of right wing back are still stellar, right? When you kind of benchmark this against a lot of the other midfielders, this is still very, very good. And there's still that sort of expectation of potentially being able to get defensive contributions. And that's also why I struggled, for example, to put Caicedo in that top tier, because as Chelsea's fixtures get worse and worse, I'm not really sure that the expectations can be that great for Caicedo. In theory, he should still be matched by some of the players who are a little bit cheaper in that sort of 5.3 range, the 4.9 range even. But of course, he's overperformed. With Minte, I still think you still have that double-pronged threat in terms of NPXG and XAG. The CBRIT has actually gone down compared to what I expected, so I don't think we can really say that there's sort of outlets there for him to get points. But the key thing is that he is close to a 90-minute player, so that's something that, even when I go back to someone like Dango, you do run the risk of looking at Dango as potentially a pick who can struggle when it comes to, let's say, securing the full 90 minutes. However, I tend to think if you almost view, let's say, this Brentford team as a team that's more willing to play the back three versus tougher opponents where you probably wouldn't play Dango anyways, I guess there's a value add there in thinking that Dango's minutes will be relatively good in the games you want him to play, like a Burnley at home in game week 12, or game week 13 rather. As far as, let's say, the next tier in terms of the 6.5 plus tier, Enzo for me has a huge asterisk. I think Chelsea have the first game within game week 12. So we now subscribe to the theory that if he posts an Instagram post of almost like himself and his face within the match day graphic, it's very likely that he'll start. And of course, when you look at the underlying stats, he's actually very, very top. His minutes when he's fit and available for Chelsea have always been good. My concern for this Burnley game and why I still have an asterisk over Enzo, even though it seems like he's more than likely going to be fit for this match, is if this Chelsea team is going to do Barcelona in the midweek and then Arsenal in the weekend after that, how likely is it that Enzo's going to play really, really good minutes here versus Burnley, when actually some of the other fixtures coming out of this run are going to be a lot tougher going forward. So that is kind of my general concern. As far as some of the other picks here in terms of, let's say, a Sarr and a Rice, you know, the guarantee is just that they're going to play 90 minutes going forwards. Now, of course, there are some odd games where Rice can get benched, and I think we've seen that this season. You know, that there is an opportunity, maybe especially within that Brentford game, when I look at Arsenal's fixture run, once you factor in Champions League with the Bayern Munich match, that yes, maybe someone like Rice could be benched, but I still think you're not going to see mass rotation from Arsenal. It's not something that Arteta really dabbles with as much as, let's say, someone like an Enzo Maresca does. So for me, he's a really solid pick. When you look at Rice, of course, I think a lot of the baselines are that he's more of an all-rounder. He is not someone who just chiefly gets his returns from open play. You're actually looking for more things like bonus expectations coming out of set piece chances created, and then you're also looking at that sort of hidden DEFCON points potential in a similar way to sort of how Njai works, but Njai just has much worse fixtures, although he does have the added benefit of being a penalty taker. With Sobo, I think the 4 yellow cards precludes him from getting a rise in the cheat sheet. I think this is a good run to own Sobo. I would absolutely hold him through this run. You know, as an owner, you don't really care about this 4 yellow card piece. You just play him until he's suspended. However, as someone buying, I think that the issue that you can run in with someone like Sobo is simply that you buy him for a run. You might not have the deepest team possible at this moment in time. This is a period where there's rotation. And of course, if he gets suspended within one of these matches, you might not be able to call upon a good auto sub or sort of replacement within a week. And maybe he actually necessitates a transfer. And that's not ideal, even though I think Sobo on paper is actually a really good pick, because he kind of is like the Rice of Liverpool in a sense, and with slightly better DEFCON expectations, but probably worse expectations in terms of like propensity to getting clean sheets or even, let's say, expected assisted goals just from the set piece angle. Trossard's been added because his form's been exceptional, but I think it is a bit unfortunate that I haven't had Trossard in a while. Maybe that's an omission from my part, and I can totally accept that. You know, there was definitely an opportunity, I suppose, over this run of games with Trossard playing so well, where Martinelli was out, where he made a lot of sense as a pick. As it turns out, of course, a lot of players are coming back from injury, including Martinelli in a few weeks' time. So I feel like the concern with Trossard is how long and how much permanence or staying power does he have as a pick? And at the same time, would you not still pick someone like Rice in the meantime, which I think I still would. In the next tier, I have Eze. He might actually drop in the future, but I feel like the big question, of course, is whether this Odegaard is ready to play for the Tottenham game, or whether he's going to be eased in as well throughout the schedule, and someone like Eze's minutes are going to fizzle out. So I feel like as someone who owns Eze, this is more a case of you play him for Tottenham at home, but after that you reassess. And with all the other picks here, I think the unfortunate piece is, of course, Gakpo's minutes still look very, very suspect. The benching versus City is a good reflection of that, because they just basically play the same starting 11 that played versus Real Madrid. I think a lot was sort of said about the Liverpool performance versus Man City. Like, you can probably say that the first half was toothless. At the same time, they were playing at the Etihad, and probably the expectations for Liverpool, I think, you know, either you have expectations for Liverpool as a top team, and that performance was maybe unacceptable, or you have, let's say, somewhat reduced expectations for Liverpool, but also still recognize that they're still probably the third best team in the Premier League. And from that perspective, they still have value within the game. And so someone like Gakpo, if he got good attack minutes, would be great. But I think the uncertainty is there in terms of, is he going to be a key part of lineups going forwards? And I think as long as you have that doubt of, let's say, if Gakpo is going to get benched any certain game, he's not going to be worth it over this fixture run, because you're just going to miss out on points. And also, even if he starts games, yes, of course, we've seen 90-minute matches from Gakpo whilst the whole team has been fit. But I think at the same time, you've also seen, let's say, a 15-minute cameo, a 20-minute cameo, and that's not really good enough. With Gordon, we'll kind of monitor the injury situation. But with the City game and the Everton away game, I don't think there's really a need to even consider Newcastle players up until at least game week 14. With Shad, for me, it's a differential, because I still think at the price point without penalties, I'm not sure he's that interesting. His underlying stats have been quite impressive year on year on year. They don't look that impressive now, but I think that the consistency with Shad is there, and the minutes are chiefly there. Whilst if, let's say, Brentford were to have a better fixture run, or you were to consider, let's say, a free hit option, like, he's going to be someone that you consider. In the next few tiers, I've actually added Foden with a rise. I think the minutes expectations have actually improved for me. My concern was going to be, were there opportunities for, let's say, with Foden not playing particularly well, maybe just in terms of production, more so than, let's say, I think he's doing really well in terms of The additional role that he kind of has this season is he drops a little bit deeper. So does Bernardo, generally speaking. I think this is a way that City have almost evaded some of their issues with sort of dealing with against, let's say, opposition press. Having, for example, more technical players like Foden drop deeper. But that also, I think, has a role shift that kind of changes how Foden's production looks like within the game. So his underlying stats this season have taken a noticeable dip. I'm not here to say that this is going to be Foden for the rest of the season. I still think he has good expectations to do well. And I think this is also, once again, a player that I have to remind myself is one of the best ball strikers within the Premier League. When you actually chart, for example, things like finishing. So what do I mean by this? I mean, just pure NPXG compared to actual goals, right? Like over the many seasons of data that we've had publicly available, Foden's one of the best players that we have within the league. Son's gone. Foden has sort of taken that mantle as being, I think, the best striker left within the league, just in terms of how he finishes kind of like these low XG chances and just in terms of general conversion. So I still feel like when you look at a game like Dortmund and you can see, okay, he can still do the brace, he can still do the outside the box goals and the finishes. I think Foden with good minutes is still a good pick within the game, and I'm willing to sort of stand on that hill. As far as Semenyo, it feels like there's no real injury to him. I think he just proposed to his soon-to-be wife, now fiance. So congratulations to Semenyo. Congratulations to Semenyo owners who might not have an injury on the cards, and maybe they have a dubious yellow flag, but he should be fine. I think just look forward to this fixture run. However, I do have to say that Semenyo, in my opinion, is not someone who's essential. When you kind of take away the West Ham at home game, and what I mean by this is if you were kind of to look at Semenyo and you think about long-term, what kind of picks you want to own within the game, I don't think it's crazy to suggest that there is an opportunity for managers to consider selling Semenyo. So that's just something to put out there. With Mbemo, I feel like he's just a fantastic pick until AFCON. And so if people have the opportunity to jump onto him, very much like Bruno Fernandes, I think these are both picks that you want to be moving into, even as soon as this week. Even though, yes, Crystal Palace away in Gameweek 13 is not a particularly good fixture, the general fixture run for United is quite good. And I think also that we just lack options within the midfield. So that's why these options are appealing to me. With Salah, I think he gets a rise as well. I still struggle to see kind of him losing out too many minutes within the Premier League. He simply has the contract. He simply has almost the minutes kind of guaranteed into it. And this is a really good fixture run for Salah. But the usual questions of how do you even create a Salah plus Haaland team are there. And then also, I mean, if you're going to ever pick Salah over Haaland, I just don't think I would take that risk at this point this season. And that's kind of how I sit on that. But for a game week like this, in Game Week 12, I mean, he's certainly a captaincy option. That's what makes Salah interesting. Moving on towards the forwards now within the cheat sheet. I think the key thing within the forwards is there really is no movement. A lot of the movements within the forward position are just prompted by injuries. I've only given Krupi Jr. a drop because the minutes, as we can see, of course, with the benching finally, with Evan Nilsson coming back and sort of finally starting his first game post-injury, that just suggests that we're going to see less Krupi minutes. The positive, I think, when you compare it to, let's say, some of the other potential 4.2, 4.3 million type forwards is he actually does give you value as an auto sub, right? The nice thing with Krupi Jr. is his NPXG is stellar. It seems like, I think, early signs just watching him play. I was a football manager who was very keen to see how he would do in the Premier League. And of course, fully aware that he moved from League 2 or the second league within France and has actually acclimated very well towards Bournemouth. But yeah, the minutes don't seem like they're there. But he can give you auto sub potential, and I think he's already shown a propensity to score goals. And interestingly, I think when I look at the markets and the season-long goal kind of odds for him, they're still projecting quite a few goals to come from him for the rest of the season. So I think just there is a value aspect here in terms of being able to get an auto sub return from someone like Krupi Jr. Not to say that we should totally overshoot our expectations, but I think also if you were to say that there were, let's say, other injuries in other positions, like for example, if Bournemouth were going to lose maybe another 10, Krupi Jr. has played occasionally somewhere centrally within the team. So that could allow for him to play, behind an Evan Nilsson, or if Evan Nilsson has another injury, and so far it seems like he is relatively injury prone, Krupi Jr. will have value. Otherwise, though, I just think, this is a good period to hold a Waltmart. This is a good period to hold a João Pedro. If you don't have, let's say, the need to move towards Thiago, for example, let's say if you own Waltmart, I guess you don't necessarily see Thiago as someone that you must sort of pivot into, because despite Waltmart having City at home, Brighton away isn't a particularly good game for Thiago. And then, of course, Thiago has some poorish games in 13-14. So maybe the time you make that move, or 14-15, is worse. So I think the time you make that move could be a little bit later into the season. as far as, let's say, a João Pedro, this is still a game that you absolutely give towards him. And if you're free hitting on 13, maybe you get to extend the stay and of João Pedro. What I like about Matera is purely just that sort of NPXG per 90. The thing with Thiago, I think, is it is fair to say that he's overperformed a bit, but two of his goals, I believe, or maybe even 3 of his goals so far have been on penalties. So that's an added value that isn't reflected by NPXG, which is totally fair that he scored them. And I think, simply put, him playing 90 minutes just means that he's going to be in a stature of his own, because when you compare it to someone like Welbeck, I think there's more of a propensity for Thiago to drop 90-minute games consistently up until the end of the season than I would say the same for Welbeck, where there are at least some of the use within this Brighton team that can take away his minutes going forwards, and you don't know what Hertzler really is going to do. With Sesko and Gyökeres, Sesko seems to be out for a month, so I think he can safely be removed as a pick within the cheat sheet, so that's why he's gone. Gyökeres seems like he's maybe out for Tottenham at home, so unfortunately that just makes him a non-option for this week, but maybe later down the line, it really just depends on whether Havertz is able to come back into the squad and how easy he's able to acclimate, because I still can't see how Gyökeres is going to be a good pick if Havertz is also close to coming back himself. In the defender position within the game, I feel like this is one of those weeks where there's not too many changes. I've actually added Ballard because I think it seems like he's just one of the largest set piece threats that we've ever seen in the Prem. I don't think that's really overstating things. This is someone who, on the underlying so far, has been extremely impressive. Like, he actually has better underlyings than Gabriel does, and is close to, let's say, some of the more open play threats that are classically seen, like a Timber or a Calafiori, within how they're utilized for Arsenal this season. And that sort of number is close to the attacking fullbacks within other teams, like a James or a Munoz. And so very, very impressive numbers. I think the defensive contribution numbers for Ballard are excessively impressive as well. So he just deserves to be here. And of course, the small sample size helps, I think, bolster the CBIT per 90 numbers, because Ballard has has only been playing within a certain few games in the Premier League, because he's also been in and out with his own injury. So I feel like the numbers here are not to say that he's maybe, let's say, the 3rd or 4th best CBIT player within the game from defense. I think it just suggests that, once again, when you look at a team like Sunderland, a lot of their defenders do get really good CBIT per 90 numbers. And at the same time, someone like Ballard is going to enjoy a piece of that pie, but he's also probably one of the largest set piece threats in the league, and probably is, right? If Gabriel's going to be out for a month, then that's going to significantly change the landscape of the game, and Ballard's definitely an option. Lacroix, I've given a rise. I just think that Crystal Palace ultimately are so good on defense that maybe I was underrating Lacroix compared to his peers, because I feel like, okay, if I was an FPL manager, would I buy Richards first? Yes, but I think at the same time, is it a problem to actually own both? Like, maybe if Guehi was maybe unavailable for Game Week 11, which it seems like, or Game Week 12 rather, which it seems like he's not. It seems like he might be ready for this game. Is there an opportunity for someone like Richards potentially to lose his position to Canvo if Canvo continues to play really well and continues to deputize well for either a Richards or Guehi? And maybe this Lacroix's position, in terms of him actually being that central center back of the team, be more important, right? If there's the risk towards Richards, and as we've seen, Richards has struggled to sort of maintain that rhythm of playing 3 games a week, and as we approach this December schedule, I think you do need nailed players, and Lacroix does present himself as that. Thiago I've given a drop just because of the Newcastle sort of really poor performances, and still like not too many great fixtures in sight. Some of the defense contribution numbers are also slipping a little bit. As far as Virgil, I've given him a rise. I've also given Saliba a rise. I think this is partially for Virgil, at least just a pure fixture play. In terms of, let's say, someone like Saliba, this is completely owed to the Gabriel injury. And I think it's fair to make the argument that, let's say, when Gabriel's out, is Saliba a bit more of a pronounced set piece threat within the team? I would say yes. Maybe it's anecdotal to say this, but when you look at, for example, other periods where, let's say, Gabriel was missing, I think Saliba became a bit more of a key set piece threat. Would I still pick Timber and Calafiori if I was 100% sure that Timber and Calafiori were going to start every single game? Sure. But I don't think I can say that with full certainty. Like, I still think this Arsenal team is going to try go full strength versus Bayern Munich, and maybe that hurts their opportunity to start a game versus Brentford. Now, I could also be wrong, and maybe Arsenal's efforts, at least at this stage of the season, where they're still involved within group stage matches in the Champions League, they're not going to be important in the playoffs other than seeding. Maybe these Premier League matches are actually going to be prioritized, and someone like Timber and Calafiori could actually be more likely to start the Premier League game if you want to make the flip side of the argument there. And probably if they continue to keep starting, I mean, they're better than Saliba. But I just think that I don't see, unless Saliba has injuries, and of course he's had injuries this season, how he's going to have less of a chance to start every single game compared to Timber and Calafiori. And that's simply just going back to, let's say, Calafiori and his own inability to kind of start 3 games a week, which we've seen for this Arsenal team almost since the start. And then with Timber, I just think, is it an opportunity to play Ben White at least once? And I think realistically, I would answer yes. So that's how I feel about the defensive position. Most of the fixture runs are not turning, for example, in a week like Game Week 12. I think a lot of people have seen, for example, in the distance that Game Week 13 is probably a pretty good fixture swing window, but we will see. In the goalkeeping position, just to round things off, I haven't actually made any changes towards goalkeepers whatsoever. I just feel like this landscape's a little bit stuck. Like maybe Verbruggen is actually deserving of being a green goalkeeper as well. I kind of like Verbruggen just from the perspective of he actually rotates well with Dubravka. So I think that's something that's not priced in necessarily towards a goalkeeper individually. The fact that they rotate well with, let's say, someone like Dubravka, who has, some value at least of being a goalkeeper who plays for a team within the Premier League, even though he does play for Burnley, who I think are the worst defense by far within the league. And the numbers do show that in terms of expected goals conceded. That just depends on, whether you're willing to sort of bite the bullet and jump into a team like Brighton, who've just gotten 2 clean sheets back to back and actually, generally speaking, have a pretty good fixture run ahead. So those are my thoughts in terms of the cheat sheet for this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. Unfortunately, there's not too many changes. I feel like the international break has given us some injuries, and I think has given a lot of sources of transfers from multiple different directions for FPL managers. But the key thing is, for example, if a lot of people want to move into City players, this is still probably not the week to do so, just because of the Newcastle game. So a lot of the movements in terms of certain players would be, let's say, around Liverpool and their fixture run, but it's hard to sort of see which Liverpool players you really want outside of the defensive positions, where I've also given Konate a rise. At the same time, I think someone like Guardiola is interesting, but also, once again, from the perspective of looking at a Game Week 13 plus. So that's sort of something that I think some people want to think about. If you can maybe hold transfers this week and you're actually looking towards getting City players, waiting until Game Week 13 could make sense.